Good morning. My name is Chantal Oudraat. I'm an Associate Vice President here at USIP in charge of the Jennings-Randolph Fellowship programs. This morning we have heard from both Ambassador Verveer and Ambassador Jonge, and they have really provided us, I think, with a terrific background and context of Resolution 1325. But to delve in a little deeper in this area and what are exactly the lessons and the experience of the resolutions on the ground, we have a terrific panel this morning. People who have all in different ways and different capacities been at the forefront of the fight to give full attention to women in conflict and post-conflict situations, and to give women more voice at the negotiating tables. To start off, we will hear from Victoria Holt. She's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Organizations in charge of the UN peacekeeping operations portfolio. And I think the U.S. government could not have picked a better person than Tori Holt for this portfolio. Prior to joining the government, she crisscrossed the world, both in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, and co-directed with Bill Dirch the path-breaking work of the Stimson Center on UN peacekeeping operations. I think Tori Holt has also been a tireless champion of women's rights and a generous mentor to numerous young women wanting to enter the field of international peace and security. And lastly, I would like to mention Tori's invaluable efforts to advance the agenda on women and for women when she was a member of the board of Women in International Security. Second, we will hear from the Executive Director of Women in International Security, or WIIS, like we like to call this organization. WIIS is one of the partner organizations of this meeting, is a worldwide membership organization established some 30 years ago to promote the role of women in international peace and security. And under Jolynn's stewardship, this organization has expanded enormously, both nationally as well as internationally. Nationally, in the U.S., there are a number of chapters of WIIS that have opened up in the last few years. And internationally, there are a number of international affiliates of WIIS throughout the world, both in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. And we really have to thank, I think, Jolynn for this effort. She has also been responsible for a greater research effort by WIIS. It was felt, I think, by the organization that if we really want to advance the role of women, we really need to track where and what they have been doing. And her study on the role of women in UN peacekeeping operations has been path-breaking, and I think has been an eye-opener for many in the UN as well. And has been very well received. We will then turn to Sanam Anderlini, who is also one of the partners of this meeting, and actually together with Kathleen, both the brains and the drivers of this meeting. I think for many of you, Sanam hardly needs an introduction. She has been at the forefront in the fight and for the fight for 1325. She was also one of the first people who, in a report for UNIFEM, actually turned our attention to the lack or the absence of women at negotiating tables. She's the author of Women Building Peace and was appointed by the UN Secretary General a member of the UN Civil Society Advisory Group. In this panel, she will report on a major research project she has undertaken with the support of and under auspices of MIT on the experiences of women with respect to 1325. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Donald Steinberg, who is Deputy President of the International Crisis Group. Dawn, like the others on the panel, has been a great champion of women's rights and has recognized, I think, early on that women's rights are not just about women's rights, but are really about human rights, and hence are of concern not just to women, but to men as well. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Dawn, since he is an alum of the program that I'm directing here at USIP, so welcome back, Dawn. And I would like to mention that Dawn, like Sanam, is a member of the UN Civil Society Advisory Group and a contributor to a forthcoming USIP book on 1325 entitled Women and War, Power and Protection. And in the concluding chapter of that book, Dawn, provides us with a very forceful and passionate call to action and warns us that the promise of 1325 must no longer be deferred. And I think he would agree with what Ambassador Chowdhury has said earlier, and I paraphrase a little bit, and that is, we must raise our voice because only then things can happen. So we have a terrific panel. Each of the panelists will talk for about 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Holt. Victoria, it's all yours.
Should we come up here?
I think over there for the web.
Well, thank you very much for that gracious and warm introduction. But it's my pleasure to be here in a room of experts and individuals who have worked well and hard on behalf of governments, NGOs, and the aspirations of all of us to better address the suite of challenges involving women, also women, children, and men, and their vulnerability to conflict and their ability to also lead out of conflict. So my thoughts and remarks today, I'm very proud to be speaking on behalf of the U.S. State Department. And we'll focus a lot on one area of this, both the 1325 and the resolutions that have accompanied it and since the decade past, but also focus on one aspect of conflict prevention and peace building, which involves UN peace operations. Because if we have a general theme, I think right now, it's to go from aspiration to concrete activities and actions that help us not just dream well, but actually implement these very visions that people have had. So it's well known. Obviously, I'm sorry I missed the early session. I would have greatly enjoyed it, but everybody realizes that this October will be the 10th anniversary of the UN Security Council having passed Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And for many people, we're beginning to look back and forward and seeing what impact this has had across our system, whether it's government, the UN itself, or the activities in the field. And I think I can't overstate perhaps how much our Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, cares about this and the role of women's participation in all aspects of conflict prevention, mediation, leadership, and inclusive of peacekeeping. And I think we all saw that when she chaired the Security Council session last year and the follow-on Resolution 1888. And maybe just briefly to remind us why this is so important, that it is often the civilians and often the women and the children, as well as the men, who are the victims of conflict, who often themselves face the extreme force of violence, such as rape, and who themselves become vulnerable in the aftermath of war, whether the war has ended or gone forward into a society that is yet to restore itself. So what I thought I would suggest is the way that we see integration between the aspirations and the impact of 1325, as well as 1820, 1888, 1889, 1894, and how we try and link that back to both the U.S. efforts on a bilateral basis in our foreign policy, as well as the way we work well within the UN and multilateral system to impact peacekeeping operations and the way that they try and address this suite of challenges in the field. So, for example, I would say that many people have watched a transition as UN mandates have increasingly responded to what 1325 helped lay out, where we'll have UN resolutions from the Security Council offering for peacekeeping missions where this is a challenge in the field, that the missions themselves take on some responsibility for addressing the vulnerabilities of women in particular and dealing with sexual and gender-based violence as one of the challenges in the field, as well as an absolute prohibition on such activities by the peacekeeping forces themselves. Perhaps what I'll do is lay out 5 categories, which help us organize a bit how we think about moving from aspiration to better implementation, particularly for UN-led peacekeeping missions. But before I do that, maybe just a theme on peacekeeping, which is this administration has tried very hard to try and marry up our bilateral approaches to areas that have seen conflict with how we work in the international system. And this is true for peacekeeping missions. So, for example, in the Congo, where we've known for a long time of the level of violence, particularly in the east, the U.S. has focused on supporting the government's DRC national strategy to prevent and respond to sexual and gender-based violence, as well as the UN stabilization mission, which was formerly MONUC and has just become MONUSCO. So I just want to point that out, that my remarks are not just directed at the UN itself, but is something we've taken on board as a government. But the 5 areas I wanted to offer to you, first of all, are authority, willingness, capacity, knowledge, and strategy. And the reason I throw out those categories is if we look at trying to move into a better capacity to address the challenges in the field, we all have these conversations that cross these pathways and can range from military terms of tactical, operational, strategic, meaning really big picture, or down in the weeds. And this may help us think about what we're trying to achieve. So in general, on peacekeeping missions, do we have the authority for these missions to understand what their role is to address the challenges in the field to women, to children, and the vulnerable populations, inclusive of men? And I would say in general, we've done pretty well. Not only the broad resolutions of the Security Council with 1325 and the 1820, 1888, and the list, it goes on. So we have a broad framework that I think has become quite well known across the communities. Others are better experts on when a norm becomes a real norm, but I think that's the framework that many people see. The question then is for the missions themselves. And we've seen also progress with identifying individuals responsible in many of the peacekeeping missions whose job it is to look at longer-term strategies and immediate response, particularly on sexual and gender-based violence, child protection officers, and women and gender advisors who participate in these UN-led missions. We ourselves also are trying to work as members of the Security Council with the troop and police contributing countries within the UN General Assembly, the C-34 process, to bring together community people who recognize this as a component of what missions need to be aware of and address going forward. And increasingly, peacekeeping missions have had this built into their very own mandates. Congo is certainly not the only one. Didn't bring the full list, but we could certainly provide that, where this has been built into what the missions are asked to consider and address. Now, the natural challenge of this is violence stems from multiple different sources. And so you can't assume that a strategy in one place will work in another. You have to understand the causes of the kind of violence, if it's opportunity-based or not, how you reduce vulnerability, for example, how you reduce motivation, and therefore how you set up the peacekeeping mission to be more successful. And this leads perhaps to a second point about not just having the authority to take action as a peacekeeping mission in the field with the leadership that you require, but you have a willingness to take this on. Obviously, any field mission has multiple priorities that are provided to them by the Security Council. And what we've been trying to pay attention to is that chain from the Council through the UN Secretariat, working with member states, allowing the leadership to digest the environment in which they're sending in their personnel, and how civilians, the police, and the military work together to recognize these challenges. So for willingness, one of the questions is there enough sufficient support so that good intentions are moved into an ability to take actions? And I think this is still a very useful work in progress. We often refer to MONUC because it itself has tried so hard to try and look out and see what kind of vulnerabilities are there and develop the tools necessary to try and address it within the mission. On the other hand, this mission has probably had the hardest challenge of almost any current peacekeeping mission, and to do so given the level of violence and challenge we've seen in the DRC. But to really provide this mix of authority and willingness, you also need capacity. Capacity takes many forms. And before we go and look at the field mission's literal capacity, you have to say, what's the human capacity? Is there guidance to what this means? Are there plans to help the missions understand how they look at this as one element of what they're looking to achieve? And is there preparedness? Before anybody deploys the field, whether it be a civilian, a police personnel, a military officer, or the senior leadership, do they have an understanding prior to going into the mission that this is an element of what the mission will do, whether it's their job specifically or not? And then how do they integrate that? Because there are trade-offs in every mission. And so the better prepared we think that the people are before they deploy, the better understanding they'll have when they're in a meeting about all the myriad issues in a peacekeeping mission. They'll understand why that person across the table is raising sexual and gender-based violence in the meeting, whether they're talking about a mediation strategy or an upcoming election or maybe an area of insecurity. So to do this, one of the things we've been looking at is trying to help the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in its own efforts to develop guidance on protection of civilians broadly, of which this can become a component. And perhaps much of this work nicely overlaps with the ambitions of a larger community of people deeply motivated by the people in this room to look at the broad protection of civilians challenges that often grow in the field after a deployment of a mission or may even exist when a peacekeeping mission deploys. And in that element, the hope is that missions before they deploy have a good assessment of the vulnerabilities of the civilian population and an understanding of what's causing it and a way to understand what they can bring together as a mission-wide strategy to reduce those vulnerabilities, to provide conflict prevention strategies, and if necessary, act to halt and interrupt violence that may escalate while peacekeepers are deployed. I also mentioned preparedness. This includes everything from pre-deployment training to guidance and doctrine to leadership courses. And those are all elements that we need broadly for peacekeeping, but also inclusive of addressing sexual and gender-based violence. So it's integrated into the planning and mission support that each mission should have. Capacity also means just having peacekeeping missions succeed generally. And I'll just say as an aside, some of the times the challenges are what I would call the boring stuff. It's logistics in hospitals, it's an engineering unit and water delivery, and it's mobility, not just famous helicopters, but jeeps and trucks and tanks. So sometimes the mission has all the aspirations, but if they can't get around, and if they don't know enough about what's happening in the next village, let alone the next county or across the border, they're going to have a harder time implementing a good strategy. So some of the ability to move from aspiration into a concrete ability to prevent violence, deal with it up front, and hopefully interrupt it if necessary, requires the mission to be functioning well in the first place. So that's one of the capacity questions that many people go to almost immediately when you talk about expanding the aspirations for peacekeeping missions. With respect to women in particular, we also see that the forced generation process, very much a New York term, what it means is how we get the right people to serve in the mission, integrates into it these demands from the field to address the challenges and tries to line up the right expertise, skill sets, and quality of people that we want. And what we know right out of the gate is we need more women in leadership roles. We could use more women as police officers. We could use more women as uniformed military, no matter what their role. And we always know that the civilians themselves should come in, hopefully with some expertise in this if possible. And that is something that I think we all know we could do better at. We're also very happy about the creation of the Office of SRSG Wallstrom and her ability, because I think one of the things she will also have is the fourth area, which is knowledge. So if you've got the authority, you've got a willingness in a good sense, you've even got all that logistics I'm talking about, and good capacity in a mission, you still need the knowledge of what to do. And I would say that one of the challenges this community has really tried to help address is how do you understand what the nature of sexual and gender-based violence, the vulnerabilities of women and children, what are known examples of what works? And is it specific to a region or area or a particular camp strategy? Is it something that's worked mission-wide? What do we know from past experience? Because the more we can understand that, what works and what doesn't work, that knowledge can be fed back into the planning, preparedness, and policy that we hope that the UN will increasingly develop for all of its field missions. And we'll all get smarter, and we'll get better at mixing the right kind of human capital, leadership, capacity, and we might even write council mandates better. So finally, the fifth piece, which is the pretty bow that ties us all up, which is strategy. So if we get authority, willingness, capacity, and good knowledge, you still need the strong leadership to pull it together. Because every one of us has a job where someone runs in the door and says, wait, stop, I need you to do this right now. And we always need to respond to the urgent. So a strategy is where you pull together how this fits in the bigger picture. And in the case of peacekeeping missions, the Security Council has taken this on because it's a matter of international peace and security. There are plenty of areas of instability and conflict. It's only a handful that a peacekeeping mission gets sent to, because it therefore has a certain framework to it. It's our best hunch that a push from a peacekeeping mission will help a political process take hold. And it probably needs some help with security or you wouldn't be deploying the peacekeeping mission. It's into that mix that we have a tool, and that tool can help address sexual and gender-based violence, the vulnerabilities of women and children, but it's in that context. So what's the strategy for how this fits within the larger picture? Is it absolutely core to the political stability of the area? Is it not absolutely core, but very important? Where does this kind of fall? And I think it's always on the list, but understanding how to pull that together is a challenge I think that every nation who cares about this is interested in. On the U.S. side, we do take this quite seriously from our training programs that my colleagues in the State Department help run with our colleagues in the military, the ACOTA program, the Global Peace Operations Initiative. These are efforts which we have to help train and support the deployment of peacekeepers worldwide. We partner with many countries around the world. This is always something that is a priority for us. But I would know that many countries do this as well, and this whole conference could even just look at that whole training element. So I think those were the 5 areas I thought might be useful just to lay out the way that we help organize our thinking about trying to move from aspiration to an operational capacity. And some of the things we're in ongoing discussion with in New York at the Secretariat, not just DPKO, but wide. And what we ask when we look at mandate renewals that come up before the Security Council on a regular basis, or our teams go to the field to talk to peacekeepers, or we're trying to think about what the best leadership might be for a mission. This is just a small piece, I think, of what the U.S. is trying to do to support 1325 and the upcoming anniversary. Ambassador Revere was here earlier. Her office is the champion of this in a really intense and wonderful way. They have a level of detail that is admirable, and we work closely together. So those would just be a few short remarks to set us off. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Tori, for providing us with this framework of how to think about this issue. And I think this is also a perfect segue to our next panelist, Jolynn Shoemaker. You talked a lot about human capital and human capacity, getting the right people in the right jobs. And I think Jolynn has something to say about those issues.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces and new faces here today, and I just want to thank all the organizers who did a tremendous amount of work on putting this together. I think it will be such an important and useful conversation going forward. So many of you already know about Women in International Security, or WIIS, as we call it, and Chantal spoke a little bit about some of the work we're doing. We are essentially a global network that is supporting women's leadership at all stages of careers in the peace and security field. So we're looking at the women, peace, and security agenda broadly. Certainly a great number of our members are working in conflict zones or on conflict, but we're not specifically only looking at peace processes. So in 2008, as Chantal mentioned, we started a leadership research series looking at women in leadership in various peace and security institutions. Because as Chantal mentioned, we over time realized that we really needed to benchmark what was happening in the institutions that were making policy on these peace and security challenges, and where women really were internally in these policy-making communities. So I wanted today, I'm going to, I think all of us are here today because we already understand the importance of why we should include women and the impact that can make. So I want to focus a little bit more on the how, because our research is really looking at talking to women themselves about the obstacles they have faced in these kinds of institutions, getting into leadership positions, and the successful strategies that they have used to get there. So I wanted to share some of those lessons from that, and then I can offer just some food for thought in terms of some recommendations. I know we'll have more opportunity to develop some ideas later in the afternoon. But I first want to touch on some overarching themes we've heard. And we've done now, since that report on peacekeeping, we've done a more recent report looking at women in the U.S. government in peace and security careers as well. And so now we have a little bit more of a comprehensive sense from interviewing mid and senior level women from both institutions, obviously very different institutions, but very common in terms of a lot of the feedback we got. Both reports, by the way, are on our website, the WIIS website. So most women we talk to, both at the UN and the U.S. government, view this as a critical juncture right now for women's leadership. And there is a sense of tremendous hope about the possibilities to improve women's leadership opportunities globally in the peace and security realm if there is senior leadership commitment and concrete actions taken forward. And so what women were telling us is we have, as Tori said, the framework here, and commitments, policies, all of that down the line are the important first steps, but we certainly need much more than that, and we need to address some of the cultural obstacles as well in some of these institutions. So despite all the varied perspectives, we heard these common perspectives across those two institutions with women we talked to. Number one, there's a strong sense that awareness, as I said, of the importance of women's participation and increasingly the positive operational impact, including women, is more and more being recognized. And women really felt that that was moving forward in terms of that awareness raising. Number two, women across the board said the culture has improved greatly in these environments for women seeking leadership positions. And as we many of us know, many of us can imagine, the discrimination, the overt discrimination was pretty horrendous at times in earlier decades for women trying to achieve these positions in both institutions, really. The days of that kind of overt gender discrimination have pretty much gone away. What we're left with now is implicit discrimination in a lot of cases and a credibility gap, which I can talk to in a few minutes, but mainly that women are dealing with still being in the minority in many peace and security environments, and establishing that credibility and visibility that is so essential to attaining leadership opportunities. The third common issue is that women are more women are certainly in visible leadership positions, but there's absolute feeling that obviously not in equal numbers across the board, and in many segments starkly remain underrepresented. The other issue related to this is that there is a perceived and actual mid-level drop in pretty much all of these institutions. We are not necessarily seeing the problem at entry level anymore, but where the problem is more visible is as these professional levels advance through these kinds of institutions, women drop off more and more as you get closer to the top. The fourth common issue is that women are not getting the adequate support they need to succeed in leadership positions in peace and security, mainly because there is a lack of focus on developing leaders until much too late. And so a lot of times, as I think those of us who I've worked in government, those of us here who are in government know, the incentive to sort of provide resources or training for leadership and to really pay attention to that usually occurs when people are actually going into the leadership positions. And it needs to occur much, much earlier. Fifth, the importance of senior leader commitment cannot be underestimated. And this is so, so important for women, just the women we talk to, the role models, the sense of commitment at the top. If this isn't there, it feeds into all the problems with female retention and women self-eliminating and all of that. So that's incredibly important. I don't want to focus a lot on statistics here. They're out there, and I think many of you are aware of them. But just to give you an idea, at the UN, about 27% right now of staff at the sort of lower management and above are women, about 10% women in those roles in peacekeeping. And then we've heard these statistics often. Since 1992, less than 10% of women on official negotiating teams. UN has never appointed a woman as a chief mediator. Out of 27 current UN peace operations, 5 women hold the highest position of SRSG. 6 women hold the deputy positions. And in the U.S. government, we saw certainly a little bit better, about 29% on average across government in senior executive positions, but that's across government. And it hovers usually below 30% in a lot of the agencies dealing with peace and security. And to give you an example of these pockets where women are really underrepresented, in the senior intelligence community, women only comprise 13%. So we still have a long way to go. So I will just touch on some of the sort of our key findings that I think are very important as we're thinking about the how. How do we increase women in these kinds of positions that are decision making in peace and security? First, the process of identifying our leaders in these kinds of institutions hinges on visibility and credibility. And these are two areas where women are continuing to struggle to get that foothold. As I mentioned, women remain in the minority in many of these peace and security realms, these components, defense, peacekeeping, these sort of traditional sort of male segments of the peace and security community. And there's a real sense that women have sort of this extra burden of establishing credibility very quickly when they walk into the room in these kinds of environments. There is a sense that women feel that they are able to establish that credibility, that they are able to overcome the implicit biases and sort of stereotypes fairly quickly, but there's a strong awareness of that hurdle to overcome. Visibility is the other piece of this, and it's very important because when we looked at the UN, when we looked at who is chosen to lead peacekeeping operations, the pool of candidates are people with the political gravitas, of course, the field experience and all of that, those skills, but the political gravitas, the known political personalities, and they tend to come from that pool of permanent representatives, ambassadors, ministers, those kinds of people. And as we all know, women are very underrepresented in that pool. So a lot of times, again, as I was saying a minute ago, we focus on this too late. When the position comes up, we're scrambling to try to find, a woman that would be the right fit, but we haven't done the legwork, and I'm talking we in terms of the whole community, to make sure that women have the opportunity to gain that visibility and those positions much earlier on. So it is a situation where leaders are chosen from a pool of insiders. And that this also leads to the point that we need to pay a lot of attention in the countries we're working in to make sure that those leaders are being cultivated, those female leaders, all the way up through the ranks of those governments as well, so that they are feeding into these regional and international institutions. The next thing I just want to touch upon is the path to decision making and the fact that we are losing women in the pipeline. And so the problem, as I said, this is not an entry-level problem anymore. We oftentimes have gender equity in terms of the numbers coming in. It's a problem that starts to manifest itself about 5-7 years in these institutions where women are dropping at faster rates than men. And the question of why is complicated, but these are the main reasons we heard. One, self-elimination, and a lot of times women are self-eliminating for either work-life balance reasons, or they actually don't feel like they fill the qualifications necessary for the jobs. Women are much, much harder on themselves about that. Women are leaving these institutions because they feel they have a lack of support for their career development, because they feel like there isn't a clear path forward to advancement and promotion, and because they are oftentimes shuttled into less visible positions, or positions where they're doing a great amount of the work behind the scenes, but they're not noticed and tapped for those leadership positions. So self-elimination continues to be a huge problem, and mentors are particularly important to counteract that. I want to just spend a moment talking about work-life balance, because it is a particular issue that in all of our research has generated a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, no consensus across the board. But one thing that women are saying is that it is a reason that they're not taking some of these positions when they're offered, that they're turning down some of these professional opportunities. And in the UN in particular, I think one thing we have to pay attention is to the non-family duty stations, the fact that most of the peacekeeping operations, and in many cases in the U.S. government, the hardship posts present a challenge as far as getting more women to accept that. In some senses, that gender aspect is breaking down with some of the younger men who are also declining some of those deployments. But it was also expressed as a hurdle in the U.S. Foreign Service as well. So that is something that is difficult to address, whether it's addressed through shorter deployments or other creative solutions, but we're going to need to tackle it. And across the board, flexible arrangements, which are possible, and they have been done at actually high levels, but those models are not taken and replicated, or they're not known. A lot of times there's very little awareness within these institutions that those kinds of arrangements can be made, and there's oftentimes not support from the leadership, and this is very key. Even if the institutional possibilities are there to enable women to stay and move up in these kinds of flexible arrangements, if women feel as if the culture is not supporting it and their leadership is not supporting it, they're not going to take it. Lastly, I'm running out of time, so I may skip over the recommendations, but I just want to hit on three main things in terms of preparing leaders that we need to think about closely as we're trying to get women in higher positions here. One is preparing them earlier through training, but also mentoring is so key. And what we found is that women who had attained high-level, visible, powerful positions in these institutions, a lot hinged on what we call sponsors, not just general mentorship, but people, and mostly men, who pick up the phone and actually advocate for these women to get senior-level opportunities. And we need those sponsors, those powerful sponsors within the institutions, to advocate for the female candidates for them to get chosen for those roles. And then also we found very similar leadership styles in terms of women. This is not surprising to any of us in the room. Consultative, collaborative, all those things came up again and again. And the other point being that women can play a tremendously important role as role models, not only to other women in these institutions, but when we're talking about being out in the field, role models and interacting and outreach to the women in the field as well. So I don't want to use up any more of my time, but I do have a number of recommendations that I'd be happy to share from both of our reports, and I think maybe the afternoon session or the discussion part of this session is the appropriate place for that. So thank you so much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jolynn, for this tour de force of putting all this huge report into 10, 12 minutes. So we've heard now how women look at these issues, both in the U.S. and the UN. I'd like to give the floor now to Sanam and see, what do women say in the conflict zones about these issues in about 1325?
Thank you. I'm going to share with you very raw initial findings of a piece of research that I started doing with the MIT Center for International Studies last year, because what we found was that 10 years have gone by. People have been doing things, good intentions, and so forth on the ground, trying to engage women in peace processes, and we were having all these national action plans also being developed. But nobody was actually stopping and saying, what's working, and what's happening, and what are the women themselves saying about the interventions that we have imposed on them, given them the opportunities, and so forth. And that the statistical results of whatever it is that we've done or have not done are somewhat concerning. So let me just start with that. Out of 300 peace agreements signed since the end of the Cold War, 18 of them reference gender and sexual violence. 18. Okay. Now, if you look at any war in the past since the 1990s, sexual violence has been a prominent factor, whether it's Bosnia or Rwanda, DRC, you name it, it's there, and it's only in 13 places. Women have been fewer than 7% of negotiators on official delegations to peace processes since 2000, so since the resolution was passed, and only 2.7% of the signatories. And as Jolynn mentioned, in 13 major peace agreement processes that have been sponsored by the UN, there has not been one single UN-appointed senior mediator, basically. And when I say UN, we sometimes think of the UN as this headless, faceless body that sort of hovers there. It's actually member states, let's be honest. Okay, it's our own governments that play a major role in who gets what position and so forth. So it's the UN and our own governments. Now, this is all in context where not only are women at least 50% of the population, they're probably more because the men have either died or they've gone and so forth. So it's an incredibly skewed situation. And then, now, if the peace process that we were dealing with had gone well and we were successful, it would be one thing. But the reality is that 40 to 45% of peace processes fail within the first 5 to 10 years. After you have failure, the violence that happens later on is far worse. It becomes fragmented and things get much worse. even in the places where we've had successful peace processes, in the sense that the organized armed group and government have come to some sort of solution, the levels of violence afterwards have been so profound that we're now seeing states actually threatened. So if you look at Central America, we're seeing all sorts of violent problems happening. So it's not like we're doing this peace-building business very well to carry on the same model of negotiations. It's the entire problem. There's a problem at a very basic level. And I think we've heard a lot about why women should be at the table, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what we see them doing, actually, when they're involved in peace negotiations or engaged in the discussions. But the basic premise that we seem to have is that we're still dealing with contemporary 21st century conflicts with a very 20th century mindset. We bring the belligerents to the table as if it's an interstate situation, and the governments or the militaries can negotiate, and then they make a ceasefire and they go back home to their bit, and maybe they don't have to deal with each other anymore. The modern day wars that we see are just not like that. When we say a peace process, what does it mean? It means that Bosnians and Croatians and Serbs have to live together again, or Hutus and Tutsis or in Burundi have to live together again, even though there's been rape and pillage and killing going on in their villages. So the business of building peace and making peace is far more complicated now than the ending of war. And yet our processes are designed to deal with the ending of war, and we reward basically violent behavior. If you come forward as a non-violent actor and interested in peacemaking, there are a million different hoops that you have to jump through, and you don't get recognized for your contributions. But if you lob a bomb and you're a bad actor, next time there's a round of peace talks, we get you into the table. And this is really sending a bad message. So there's that fundamental problem. Now, what are we seeing in terms of the impact of 1325? The language in 1325 talks about women, it talks about indigenous conflict resolution methods, it talks about civil society. There's a sort of mixture of terms used to reference women. 1820 and 1889 specifically mentions civil society in a much stronger way, and I'm going to focus my discussion really on the role of civil society, because what we're finding is that the focus on the single woman to get there, and assumption that one woman is going to make all the difference is just flawed. And in fact, what we're seeing is that formal processes, the participants to negotiations are bringing the one woman to make themselves look good. So in Aceh, for example, GAM, the Aceh movement, actually in the interviews that were done, they said they wanted to look progressive, to have a woman there. In Sri Lanka, there was one woman. She was the Minister of Housing. She was also the head of the largest Muslim party. And she herself says, I think I was used. I was put there. So I think that the focus on the one woman, or the sort of just the physical body is not the issue. It's actually who they are, what do they represent, and what is their constituency that matters. So the other things that we're seeing and what we're hearing from the ground is that the prevention, first of all, the prevention of war is just not being talked about anywhere. In fact, we keep seeing conflicts going, situations getting worse and worse, and women are standing up and saying, hey, things are getting bad, but the international system is not coping with that. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of initiatives around that in a minute. But beyond that, we're also seeing that the continuum of war and peace is also getting messier. So if the 1990s was a decade where compromise and peace negotiations was part of the kind of framework of what we were dealing with, and we were getting warlords or terrorists or whatever you wanted, freedom fighters, at the table with governments to resolve their issues, what we're seeing in the post-9/11 era and the post-war on terror era is that actually all-out victory and war is okay. So in Sri Lanka and in Colombia, the government policies were, we're going to fight this out and we're going to win the conflict. Now, it's in Aceh, and interestingly enough, what we saw was that the tsunami recovery process subsumed what was going on with the conflict. So people are still dealing with the conflict issues, but recoveries come in, and it's as if the conflict really doesn't matter. And that's a problem, because you're leaving these root causes to fester, and it's going to come back at us at some point. And I think that the Oslo process of years by is probably the first example of what happens if we don't deal with the process in a comprehensive manner. Also, what we're hearing from the Israeli-Palestinian groups is that they felt as if the existence of the process automatically meant as if, there's post-conflict going on. And so there was an attempt at doing reconstruction without dealing with the fact that Palestine was still a militarized, occupied space and the issues hadn't been resolved. So we're sort of jumping the gun in terms of what is peace process and what is not and the aftermath. The second thing that I think is quite interesting is that the peacemaking in the form of, if we are going to have peacemaking be focused on ceasefires and power-making deals and power-sharing deals, which is what it seems to be, that space is important, but it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. In fact, the informal space is very, very important. And if you look at Liberia, what you see is that they had 15 failed peace agreements and processes that happened. And women mobilized in the 1990s, they learned their lessons, and in the 2000s when they remobilized, what they did was they got themselves into the negotiating process itself. But the key issue was the women who mobilized outside and were putting the pressure on in a very public space and promoting accountability and saying, we want peace, get on with it. So that connection between the inside and the outside is very, very important. And I'll talk about how we can assist and support that in a minute. The third point that comes out is that for, oh my goodness. Okay, so for civil society groups, what we're also seeing is that the post-conflict space becomes very contested because governments want the funding to go through government, and civil society is saying they don't have capacity, they're leaving a vacuum, we're doing the work, and so there's a gap. And actually the vacuum that is left gets filled by militants and criminality. So I think that those are some of the issues. Bad news. So on the good news side, we see 1325 being used. It is definitely giving legitimacy, and people are have incredibly creative ways of how this resolution has enabled and given women voice. Bad news. The international community, whether it's the UN or our own governments, are just being reactive or inactive. So every time we've had any progress for women at the peace table, it's because women have had to push. It's never been because the UN says, this is a resolution, it's our resolution, we have to do it. Okay, so that I think is a huge problem. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, we got an email from the office of the quartet saying that 1325 is not our mandate. Now, their mandate is peacemaking. 1325 is about peacemaking. I'm not sure where the gap is. Similarly with the EU, they have a great rhetoric, but neither in Colombia or in the Israeli-Palestinian context are they taking this issue on the ground. I'm not sure how Senator Mitchell is taking it on the ground. We heard that they were just setting things off. But I think this is where we're talking about, on the ground where it matters doing it. Lots of new initiatives, but a lot of old wine and new bottle. So people are just dumping stuff under the 1325 agenda without really focusing on peace and security. The trainings, we talk a lot about training and capacity building, but the substance of the training is not related to peace and security. Okay, it's leadership training, mediation, leadership training, skills training, communication training, but it's not about enabling women to feel comfortable about talking about security sector reform or even land reform. So we need to really think about what that training is and the skills that they need. And there's a lot of problems around communication. What does this resolution actually mean? We have people saying, it's not a, it's kind of a recommendation. It's kind of there. Nobody has to really do it. So the understanding of where it comes from is a problem. And one of the big questions is, which is the UN agency that does peace? Okay, I thought this was a brilliant question. And it's not just about the UN, but it's saying, you go into these places and everybody's got their cars and their white bands and doing whatever work that they're doing, but you ask the locals and they don't know who on earth they're meant to go to talk about peace. And that's what matters to them. So the lack of coordination is profoundly concerning. And it also has to do with the monitoring and the accountability and so forth. So very quickly, recommendations. What should we do? We must practice what we preach. And it's not enough saying, the UN should do it. Are our own mediators, U.S. mediators in the country affected by conflict, are they doing this work? Is the EU doing it? And so forth. So practicing what we preach, I think, is a issue. Because if violence and belligerency is the message that we're sending, that gets you recognition, then what we're saying to women is pick up arms and then we'll count you. We just don't want to do that. We're ahead of that game. So I think that this really needs to be addressed. Second message, at the UN and both the Security Council and the Department of Political Affairs, they just have to do this work. We just need leadership at the Department of Political Affairs to show that this matters. It's not enough to have one person responsible for this entire agenda in a major department, and it also is a responsibility of donors, member states, to give the resources that those guys need to be able to hire the people and have the right capacity. A third thing, we talked about monitoring and indicators at the Security Council, but honestly, if we wait for the Security Council, nothing's going to happen. We must not let inertia at the top stifle what's happening on the ground. And what we're seeing now is the global network of women peace builders, Mavic is here, are trying to build up the momentum from the grounds up to ensure accountability and indicator and monitoring what governments are doing and embed this work at the very local level. Another initiative that ICAN is launching is the Women's Security Campaign, where basically we're saying we want women on the ground to learn and be able to deal with national security issues, and maybe have a contract with the national police saying, you, Mr. Policeman, are not going to rape and be involved in sexual violence. Now, if they sign that contract, then the women can hold them accountable. If they're not willing to sign that contract, what does that say about the national police and security forces? So really putting the accountability from the grounds up. Communication. We need 2011 to be the year where understanding of this resolution is put out there at the grassroots, communities, national government, international actors. People need to know what it says, what it means in whatever form, whether it's by song, dance, guidelines, whatever, but very specific understanding of what this is, the issue is. It's been translated into over 100 languages. I don't think that there is any other Security Council resolution that has that already, so we have a good base. Coordination, in-country mechanisms, working groups on 1325 that bring together government, civil society, international actors to really coordinate what's being done, make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, and actually addressing the participation issues. And also at the international level, we need the same kind of mechanism for coordination. Funding and support to civil society organizations. Again, this is a huge, huge gap because civil society does things that governments cannot do, and often will do things and say things that governments may not want us to be saying and doing, but they are an important part of both the peace building and the state building component. And one of the initiatives that we've thought about launching is the 1325 Civil Society Fund to enable major donors from the West to channel funds through like a wholesaler or clearinghouse, so that we can then hand the money in parcels to NGOs on the ground that need it in a more effective and small parcels of money, so that we can actually build up institutional capacity. I think, and then finally, I think the UN Women Agency that is being launched. We need to get together and have a strategic planning effort for them and with them about how this agenda gets embedded into their work. It's getting lost in the weeds at the moment, and we really need all our heads together to address this. I'm going to end with a quote from Lema Gaboe, who was one of the key women in Liberia who talked the talk, walked the walk, and was really an instigator in what became the success of the Liberian peace process as we have it now. She says, we showed our commitment through our peace advocacy. We showed it when we went to the cantonments to disarm the boys. We said it through the elections. We say it on behalf of women everywhere. We are capable. Hold on to our hands and let us walk this walk together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sanam. I think you've given us much food for thought for the afternoon session as well. You've really focused, the way I see it, 1325 has really two pillars. There is the one pillar of power and participation and the other pillar of protection. And you have focused, as well as Tori and Jolynn, have focused a lot on the power and participation pillar of 1325. I think with Dawn we're going to look at the other part of the pillar of 1325, that is protection. And lastly, I would like to just let us keep in mind, particularly for the afternoon session, I think as well, is your point about training and the substance of training that is not really about peace and security, and I think that is a point very well taken, and it should be a point to be very well taken by USIP as well. So thank you very much for that. Don.
Thank you, and it is also a great pleasure to be here today. When we in New York realized in February of 2008 that we only had 1,000 days left before the 10th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, we came together a number of the activists, a number of government organizations, a number of UN institutions to talk about how we would commemorate the 10th anniversary. And I think we went through what I call the 5 stages of 1325 recovery. First, we said, well, let's have a celebration. And then we sort of thought, and we realized that there wasn't that much to celebrate. Yes, there have been progress. Yes, there has been more women appointed to positions. There's an awareness of the issue, et cetera, et cetera. But a celebration didn't seem appropriate. And then we said, okay, how about a stock-taking exercise? And in reality, we had already taken stock. And a lot of the people in this room have indeed done that. Sexual violence is increasing. Rape is a weapon of war. 3% of the funding in post-conflict donors conferences goes to issues directly related to women. 1 out of 13 participants in peace processes, even today, are women. We are seeing patterns of systematic exclusion at all levels of these processes. So we said, okay, how about institution building? And then we realized we have a lot of institutions out there: UNIFEM, DAW, INSTRA, OSAGI. We now have UN Action Against Sexual Violence, bringing together 13 organizations, ESAC. We now have a high-level working group consisting of all the heads of UN agencies headed by the Deputy Secretary General. We have, as a result of 1888, Margaret Wallstrom's office. And now the group that Sanam and I are proud to be a part of, led by Mary Robinson and Binta Diop, providing advice to the United Nations on how to implement this agenda. So we decided we didn't need that. Then we said, how about a norm-setting exercise, a preparation of operational guidance? And the truth is, we're pretty good on this as an international community. We know what the agenda is out there. We have speeches, we have resolutions. The United States, the European Union, the UN, the African Union, all have adopted some pretty good language here. And even when you get pretty specific, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about the question of protecting displaced women from sexual violence, there's fantastic language there. It's rights-based. It is incorporating the views of women from the ground. It is reflective of past experiences. It's a how-to guide, but it's not being done. And so finally, what we came up with as an exercise is that we need to break down Resolution 1325, assess what are the commitments that we as an international community have made to women in the context of armed conflict, and adopt time-bound, fully funded, transparent, measurable goals and indicators to say, where are we going? And again, I want to repeat, time-bound, fully funded, transparent, and measurable. And we need rewards and sanctions to make sure these are implemented. We need to name and shame the individuals, the governments, the UN institutions, the non-state actors who are not fulfilling their commitments under these requirements. So it's all about empowering women to play the roles that we've all been talking about. There's an expression that they use in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And I think it's a key for us to be thinking of in this area as well. I wanted to very briefly tell you where my background in this area essentially comes from, and that goes back to the time when I was working in the White House as Bill Clinton's advisor for Africa, and we were negotiating the Angolan peace agreement in 1994. As you know, Angola was faced with a civil war that had cost 500,000 lives, had left 3 to 4 million people displaced, had resulted in 1 million landmines being planted in the country. And we brought the parties together at the end of the Cold War and negotiated a peace agreement that was signed in November of 1994. And I remember giving a presentation to a group of civil society actors on the agreement, and one person raised, interestingly, his hand and said, how does this agreement relate to women? And I said very proudly, there is not a single aspect of this agreement that's discriminatory against women. I was very proud of myself. Well, Bill Clinton then asked me to go out as the American ambassador to Angola to help implement the agreement. And it took about 3 weeks on the ground to realize that a peace agreement that calls itself gender neutral is by definition discriminatory against women. And let me walk you through why that is. We had a peace implementation body that basically looked a lot like this, with 40 people sitting around the room representing the government, the UNITA rebels, Portugal, Russia, the United States, and the United Nations. 40 people. How many women? None. The closest we had to a woman at the table was the Russian ambassador's interpreter. And I can guarantee you that while we were talking, she would occasionally roll her eyes as if, what are these men doing? What that meant was that key issues related to women, issues of sexual violence, issues of girls' education, issues of demobilization of women soldiers, were completely ignored. But equally important, we did not have the voices of civil society in that room. And so when the going got rough and the peace process started to unravel, women did not feel a part of the process and were not supportive of getting the agenda back moving again. The agreement was based on 13 separate amnesties that forgave each other for anything that they had done in the context of the 20-year war. There was even one amnesty that forgave you for anything you might do 6 months into the future. And what this meant, first of all, was that men with guns were forgiving other men with guns for crimes committed against women. Secondly, it told the people of Angola, this is not your peace process. This is the peace process, as Sanam was saying, for the people with the guns. And it created a sense of a cancer at the heart of all of our efforts to reestablish rule of law in the post-conflict period. Third, we brought all these soldiers to quartering camps, and we said, just hand in your gun, you'll get all these benefits, and you get to stay here as long as you want, etc. Well, what we didn't focus on was that women did not have guns. They were, in general, cooks, they were bearers, they were messengers, they were sex slaves, and therefore we lost literally tens of thousands of combatants who were an integral part of the process and were completely left aside. The few women that we did bring into the quartering sites were subject to sexual violence constantly. We didn't manage the camps in ways that set up separate latrines for men and women, which is just an invitation to sexual violence. We didn't provide livelihoods programs or girls' education, and so as girls had to leave the camp to collect firewood to sell, systematically raped. It was a pattern that would not have existed had there been women at the implementation body. Fourth, we said to the men at the end of the demobilization process, we're going to send you back home. We're going to give you some skills, some money, some resources, and we're going to send you back to whatever community you want. And the problem with that was that they were returning to communities where they did not have a role. Women had stepped forward in those societies in the absence of men. So the men come back, they have a little bit of money, they have no power, and we saw what we always see in these situations, which is domestic violence, rape, wife killing. Same pattern that we see in all societies where men come back and are disempowered. It was as if the end of the formal conflict had launched a new era of violence against women. Finally, the one that bothers me most, frankly, is we decided that we needed to get those 4 million displaced people back home as quickly as possible, create a sense of normalization. We had 1 million landmines in the country. We demined all of the major roads, encouraged people to go back home. What we didn't do was demine the fields. We didn't demine the water supplies. We didn't demine the forests. And so as the communities returned to their villages and the men sent the women out, as they typically do, to till the fields, to collect firewood, to collect water, they were blowing their legs off in massive numbers. And again, this would not have happened if women had been at the table and helping us understand what the process was all about. Frankly, we realized all of these problems very quickly, and we did react to them. We brought out gender advisors, we did demining programs, we did quartering exercises for women, etc., but it was too little too late. And about 2 years later, when Jonas Savimbi, the head of the rebel movement, decided to pull out of the peace process, there was no pressure on him from civil society to remain a part of the exercise, and the country did, in fact, return to war, only settled in 2002 when Savimbi was killed. The point, again, is that, as Sanam was saying, if we really believed that the way we do peace processes now succeeds, that we had a good track record, then we would continue it. But when you're failing half of the time, you would think that the men leading these processes would say, why are we excluding half of the talent pool from the process, and a talent pool that brings a different perspective to all of these issues? Which is why 1325 was so important to so many of us, and why the dream deferred that we were talking about previously is so tragic to us. And so as we look ahead, I want to, because I have been given a yellow card, I want to finish just by talking briefly about something that Sanam and I are doing with respect to the Civil Society Advisory Group. I am heading a task force on women subjected to sexual violence in the context of displacement. Women who are driven from their homes, who are as vulnerable as you could possibly imagine to sexual violence, both in the process of flight and in the process of sitting in camps or in urban settings or in rural settings. And we've got a variety of things that we're doing in this context. I'm just going to go through them very, very quickly. We're proposing the distribution of guidance, which has already been prepared, which is excellent, as I said before, but making sure that's disseminated broadly. We're encouraging the United Nations in each of these situations to sign a specific memorandum of understanding, bringing together the women who are affected, as well as the local governments, as well as the peacekeepers, and defining exactly who's responsible for what agenda and holding them accountable to it. We are looking at, again, the full empowerment of women in this process, insisting that the United Nations and other agencies put together groups of women who are affected by these problems and use them not just as beneficiaries, but as planners and implementers. We're urging better data collection. We're, as I've said, focusing on not just women in displaced situations, but also women in the process of flight and women as they're returned to their communities. We're urging the United Nations to put together a quick reaction capability where it can intervene rapidly in these situations. We're encouraging host countries to provide opportunities for livelihoods and for girls' education for the women in the camps, because those are keys to preventing sexual violence. And finally, and I want to be a touch controversial here, we're urging governments to think about the broader implications of their foreign and security policies. And again, let me be a bit confrontational here. We've heard a lot this morning about what governments are doing in the Eastern DRC to prevent sexual violence, and it's all good. I've been an advisor to some of those efforts. I recognize that it's very positive. And yet, when the government of Rwanda and the government of the DRC say, we're going to get together and go attack the former genocidaires, the FDLR, and acknowledge that they haven't thought about how you're going to protect the civilians in that context, and haven't thought about how their own troops, who are massive human rights violators, are going to actually behave in the field, haven't put together civilian protection programs more broadly. When these actions occur, what's the logical outcome? That there's retaliation, that there is attacks on women. We saw massive responses by the FDLR, the former genocidaires in that community. We're seeing the same thing as we go after the Lord's Resistance Army without putting those aspects together. So we're in effect undercutting all of our efforts. We're focusing on some aspects of it, but the larger context is hurting us. My last comment is that as we look at the 10th anniversary, I think it's important to remember that we're not going to be judged by the reports we issue or the resolutions or legislation we pass. We're not going to be judged on the basis of the publicity we generate or even the money we spend. We're going to be judged on whether we have protected the lives of women faced with conflict. We're going to be judged on whether we've helped empower women in peace processes, post-conflict reconstruction, and post-conflict governments. We're going to be judged on whether we have prevented armed thugs from abusing women in displacement situations or turning girls and women into commodities through trafficking. We're going to be judged on the basis of whether we have built strong civil society networks and NGOs. And most importantly, we're going to be judged on the basis of whether we've ended the stigmatization of victimhood for women in these situations. If we can do that, the next time we have an anniversary of 1325, we can indeed celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. You speak maybe not loudly, but very clearly, and your message is very well taken. I think particularly also your message, we put this in a larger context and the broader implications of our foreign policies. An issue that Sanam was sort of touching upon when she was talking about the substance of training. I'd like to open it up for a discussion, but maybe to lead us off, I'd like to go and use the prerogative of the chair here to ask Tori Holt a question. A lot of panelists have talked about the problems of implementation. And Tori, you talked about the problems of translating aspirations into concrete action. Some of the panelists, even also in the previous session, have talked a lot about indicators and the need to put indicators clearly on the line, and that would help potentially national governments with the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325. And I wanted to ask you, particularly given your experience both in the NGO activist think tank world and now your experience in government, what are the greatest challenges you face, and do you think indeed these indicators would help governments in really implementing 1325? And maybe for the other panelists, including Ambassador Trudeau, how do we make sure, if indicators are indeed the way to go, that these indicators actually have some teeth and are being followed up? So maybe, Tori, you can start us off.
Okay. Well, anytime you have benchmarks and measures of effectiveness, it helps define for a larger community both the goals and attributes of what you want behavior to have, as well as ways to judge it. So in general, I think everybody understands the role of indicators. They're frequently also used when people are falling below the very ambitions of a project. So the general idea would be people would go to indicators, but the balance is that you get ones that are achievable so that you don't have so many outliers to it that the whole exercise ends up with people avoiding trying to report on things because they don't think they can even achieve it. So I say that more generally because I'm not actually an expert on what this community has worked so hard on, which I know is in progress, which is a series of indicators to be potentially adopted with the Council's support this fall. So I'll frame my thought that way, which is I think our hope would be, yes, that the Council could come to a view of indicators and that they would do so fulsomely, not dragging their feet, but because we do believe in this ambition and you want indicators that people already agree they want to meet versus just having it a process where you have an annual report where people don't buy in the beginning. So I would say in general it's a good enterprise. I didn't come with a list of our favorite ones. It's a conversation we're currently having. I will also say, though, that our hope always is that you're already ahead of what you would want to indicate. So it's not a substitute for other strategies and efforts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any of the other who wants to? Yes, Ambassador Chaudier. And I'm taking notes, so anyone who wants to intervene, please raise your hand.
What I wanted to bring in after what Ms. Holt just said is that indicators to be useful need to be practical and need to be welcomed by particularly the people on the ground. For the 10th anniversary, the Secretary General of the United Nations has presented 26 indicators. As a matter of fact, if you number it will be 31 because 5 of the indicators are two-sided, so A and B. So 31 indicators, but none of them really can be right away put into operation. Because Secretary General himself in his report says it will take us 2 to 5 years to develop the statistical database with a baseline for these indicators and to organize the UN system as a whole. So I believe that this is not the best way to go. We have waited 10 years and now we are talking about another 5 years. So you were not present here when I said that today at this forum I have presented my own suggestions about these indicators, which I call doable first-track indicators. And these are basically asking 4 major actors, United Nations, particularly the Secretary General's leadership role, secondly, the UN system as a whole, including the bank and the fund and all the specialized agencies. Third, I say about what countries do at the national level. And the fourth is civil society and other actors like, even the African Union or other regional forces. So all these things, and I have in that process outlined exactly what can be done. First thing is that for any set of indicators, it is the leadership which is very important. And if the Secretary General is not seen as leading the process, I think the whole system will slow down. That is what we are perceiving after 10 years. So that is what I believe it is very important. Simple things, like how many countries have discussed 1325 at the cabinet level? How many national leaders, presidents or prime ministers have included 1325 in their speeches, either at the United Nations or at their national level? How many delegations even speak about 1325 when they take the floor at the United Nations on various issues? So these are simple things. I may say it in my speech, 19 countries have presented their national action plans for 1325. I said, why then can't the Secretary General write to the heads of state saying, when is your country plan expected? So these are simple things. One letter and a little bit follow-up. And the most important follow-up mechanism of the UN system would be to involve the UN resident coordinator at the country level. They must organize, not interacting only with the governments, but with civil society. Civil society at the national level should be the primary objective of the United Nations in making 1325 come to reality. So that is what I believe should be done now, without waiting for all the statistical data. I mean, if we talk about data and reporting from the countries, I can say 70% of the developing countries will be totally uninterested. They will feel that this is again another reporting obligation on their part. And this is only to show us in bad light. Because we don't have the data, we don't have much progress. So why do I have to engage in a process which will come back on us? So that's a big disincentive of the Secretary General's own indicators. So we have to do something which they will welcome and they will feel proud to be associated with. Thank you.
I'm a very big fan of the indicators process because I don't think you can hold people accountable for things that you can't measure. And too frequently we've had governments, international organizations basically say, we don't know what we're doing on gender issues. We're not prepared to look at the numbers, but we think we're doing enough. And we had a session with the European Union about 3 weeks where the Civil Society Advisory Group went in and talked to some senior people at the UN the European Union, who specifically said, we will not measure the percentage of our funding, either in development or humanitarian assistance, that's going to women's issues, because we will not be held accountable for our own accounting measures. If you want to have the DAC, the intergovernmental group that focuses on aid, put together some requirements, we'll look into it. So, and this was basically a way of sort of stepping back from the agenda, notwithstanding the great norms that have been established within the European Union. However, I believe that it's not really just a question of looking at the numbers. It's a question of creating a mechanism of accountability within the system. And in that regard, with all due respect, 1325 was very much a product of its time. It came up at a time when the Council did not want to deal with thematic issues, where even getting this issue on the agenda and saying that women's protection and empowerment is integral to peace and security was fairly revolutionary. Contrast it with Resolution 1612, which is children in armed conflict, which established a working group of the Security Council that focuses on these issues. It established the office of Radhika Kumaraswamy. It put together a watch list of countries that were failing to meet their obligations and a requirement that there be sanctions adopted against those countries, against those institutions within the United Nations as well, sanctions in the form of sacrificed income, and even said that individuals within the UN system will be held accountable for these provisions. Within the 1612 framework as well, you have the UNICEF, massive organization that serves as a counterpart to it. We don't have anything like that for women in armed conflict. And until we do, and until there is a mindset within the Council that these issues are as important as any of the other issues on the agenda, I think we're going to be pushing against a closed door.
Sanam?
Yeah, I think that there's somewhere in between the 5-year systematic and what Ambassador Chowdhury is saying, because part of it, first of all, measuring and doing it based on numbers is itself, I think, a problem. The fact that we can have, as I said, one woman at the table, or even 50% women at the table, if they've just been brought in as the sisters and aunties, what's the point, right? The point is the quality of and frankly, I would rather have Dawn or Ambassador Chowdhury at the table than many of the women that we've dealt with, because they can represent the issues. So it's the quality question, and the substance is very important. So I think that that's something that we have to think about. The other thing is that when I look at it, and as I say, I look at the UN system of who do we bring to the table, who do we pay for to come to Doha for Darfur peace talks? It's armed groups. Why are the women who are mediated, who have come together across all the different tribes and are scrambling to raise $5,000 to get there? Why are they being left outside? Why do we not just say, you know what? As of October of 2010, the UN will recognize any groups that come forward with an agenda for peace and have a constructive contribution to make to peacemaking. We will recognize them. Why can't we do that? Why can't we do that? Right? It doesn't matter. Even if it's just Kathleen and I. If we can help, if we're in there for peace, why do we have to prove anything else? Because at the moment, if we, as I said, if we start getting violent, they'll start listening to us. So let's, that's the message that's going out. So let's just think about it in these very practical ways that can be done. The other thing that I feel is Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Department of Political Affairs, they have internal action plans that have a lot of indicators and a lot of things that nobody has stopped and said to them, excuse me, you did this in 2005. What on earth have you done about it? And let's evaluate what you've done. Because it does go up to the very top of the leadership. If the leadership doesn't demand it, the staff just can't do it. Or even when they do it, it gets pulled out of their reports and their processes. They get cornered and so forth. So the leadership has to be held accountable, and in the same way that the SRSGs have to be held accountable. These are very nice, lucrative jobs, but they are at the end of the day public servants, and they should be responding to the needs and issues of women on the ground. And how many more women have to get raped before the Security Council can, just get its act together, frankly? So. My vent, sorry.
A couple of points. I think we all, as a community, have focused so much on the numbers. Is it one woman? Is it two women? Is it not?
Just move it closer to you because of the webcam.
Oh, yeah. And maybe we're thinking of this in the wrong way, because as I've been out there talking cross-sectorally with corporations and so forth, the thought process is thought leaders, content experts. They want the best, brightest people at the table, whether, that table would be the peace process or a corporate boardroom. And it just occurs to me that maybe because we're in our own world looking at this completely separately, we're not necessarily looking at this as the best talent or the best people at the table to advocate for these issues. And they can be men and women, of course, as we see. The other point I wanted, again, looking at this a little bit more cross-sectorally, is the point about leadership. Because I think one of the things we've seen, again, looking just recently at some of the corporate firms, is as they look at this issue that they call diversity, which includes women's participation, they're focusing on creating mechanisms where the leadership all the way up to the top, CEO level, is involved on at least a quarterly basis of evaluating these things. So they're coming together, it's every level, but they've got the president of the corporation there in the room talking about this, evaluating it, going through not only the numbers, who are the people, where's the pipeline, how are we getting the best talent, keeping the best talent, and certainly they've recognized women are part of that. So I just wanted to throw that in because I thought as we were talking about this, I think a lot of times we do get hung up on the numbers, and it's one piece of that, but as Sanam said, it's the right people at the table as well.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn Thornton? Please, yeah?
I'm Evelyn Thornton with the Institute for Police Security. And I'd like to direct a two-part question, particularly to Sanam and
Hello again,
And I
Evelyn
think
Thornton.
you want to be a little bit ambigu, yeah, so that the camera will see you as well.
Sorry, I have my back to the person that I'm directing my questions, but Evelyn Thornton with the Institute for Inclusive Security, and I'll direct my questions to, in particularly, Sanam Anderlini and Ambassador Steinberg. And that first part is, what do you see as the future of the Civil Society Advisory Group and the high-level steering committee to the UN beyond the anniversary? And secondly, what are some of the other top time-bound commitments you would recommend that the UN and its member states take? And I ask that to seek your guidance and request to those of us in the audience and community as to how we can help drive those forward to achieve your recommendations with respect to the Civil Society Advisory Group and its commitments. Thank you.
Okay.
Simone, you want to start? Well,
Okay, so just a brief kind of overview of the Civil Society Advisory Group is a group of I'm not sure self-appointed. I'm not sure how I was put in there, but I was put in there. Certainly not by vote. It's I think 11 or 12 of us. It's chaired by Mary Robinson and Binta Diop, and the idea was that in the run-up to the 10th anniversary events, to have civil society voices engaging with the UN system and member states. The idea of a civil society group actually is not new. I mean, right in October 2000, civil society was already asking for that as part of a monitoring mechanism. So it took us 9 years to finally get it. But what's interesting for me is that we work on a volunteer basis, right, Don? I'm not. It's totally ad hoc and so forth. But
I get a big salary.
I know. Yeah, you get. It's not happened to me yet. Yeah, I'm waiting for mine. But we were sort of brought together with the view of giving recommendations and sort of driving this agenda forward. But also we decided that we wanted to be proactive. So there have been instances where civil society representatives from different countries have said to us, hey, something is happening. Can you write a letter to our regional rep, to the government, to whoever, and get us involved? And what we found is that one letter makes a big difference. So, of course, having Mary Robinson makes also an enormous difference in terms of the access that she has. But what I've also found is that in talking to the diplomatic corps, they listen to us because we are probably the only ones that are really focused on this agenda 100% of the time, whether it's in our own work and sort of private, in our own independent organizations or as a collective. So I think that a civil society advisory group, whether it's this one or some formulation that is more representative, is actually a very important entity to have for the UN to push this forward over a number of years. But I do think that it needs to be resourced, and I think that the mandates and what it is that we're meant to do should be more clearly articulated as well. The question of how we relate to the high-level steering group, that's a more ambiguous question because, frankly, I'm not sure how effective the high-level steering group itself has been within the UN systems. We're not getting into the jargon of institutions, but I think that's so. The question of who do we link to within the UN system is a question. And actually, my own thinking is that why can't, in the same way that it was civil society governments and UN that got the resolution and needs to implement it on the ground, why can't we have civil society, the Friends of 1325, which are member states, and UN, high-level UN representation, together working as a kind of an advisory body, recognizing that the civil society voices are going to be independent, and we're going to say what we need to say at various points, but some sort of coordination mechanism that keeps the focus and really identifies the opportunities where you just, as I say, one letter or representation can be a catalyst for a lot of things.
John, anything to add?
Sure. Again, the Civil Society Advisory Group it's actually 14 people from all around the world, people like Elizabeth Rand, Salim, Hina Jalani from Pakistan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Thelma Awori, Swani Hunt. So it is reflective of a broad geographic reach. There are 3 men out of the 14, so it's actually a nice representation because that's usually about what the number of women are in other types of groups of this kind. In terms of the practicalities of what we think ought to be done, one of our proposals has been to turn the Security Council meeting to commemorate the 10th anniversary of 1325 into a de facto pledging conference, to say that governments, UN institutions, as well as other organizations, the African Union, the EU, should come forward at that meeting and, again, indicate what aspect of 1325 they are prepared to implement, and to do it in a time-bound way, to do it in partnerships with other countries, with women who are affected by the conflict, etc. Two very specific things that we are talking about. One is indeed the area of protecting women who are subject to sexual violence and displacement. And what we're talking about there is donor countries coming up with more resources, but at the same time, the UNHCR, ICRC, other key agencies providing additional assistance. We're talking to civil society groups about providing their intellect for this exercise, their ground truths. We're talking to businesses about providing, through their social responsibility funds, assistance. But we're also talking to host countries as well, because they have a responsibility too. In many refugee settings, the fact that girls cannot attend schools outside of the camp, and the fact that women cannot work on the local economy, subjects them to vulnerabilities. And indeed, I would say livelihoods and girls' education are the two most important aspects to preventing sexual violence against women in displacement. And so they, the host governments, have a responsibility to change their laws or to assign more gender monitors. And so we're talking about a partnership that involves a contribution from a variety of sources. The second initiative that we're pushing is the notion of creating a fund to encourage women's participation in peace processes. We've talked a lot about, the willingness of negotiators to bring women in, et cetera. But one of the key constraints is resources. First of all, the question of, as Sanam was saying, simply paying for them to travel to a peace process, paying for the training that goes on in advance, paying for the stipends so that they can go off to these peace negotiations for an extended period of time and still have their families taken care of. But also one more important thing that we haven't talked about, and that is as women step forward in these situations, they are targets. They're targets of threats of sexual violence, threats of absolute murder, and we have seen around the world that probably the most dangerous profession is a woman peacemaker or peace builder. And so we need to look at resources to provide security for these individuals. We provided it in the case of Angola. We provided security details for all of the leaders of UNITA, all of the leaders of the government during those periods. We don't even think about that when it comes to women. And so what we are urging is governments around the world to come together and contribute to a fund that will actually help implement these ideas about expanding participation. And frankly, we are getting some receptivity, and it would be premature for me to announce anything here, but we're hearing from at least 3 or 4 different countries that they are prepared to step forward on these initiatives.
Thank you, Don. I think indeed real commitment, requires some real resources and some actual money, and that has been lacking, I think, in the past, and has led to a number of the implementation problems that we've had. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments in the audience. maybe as a closing, we've talked a lot about mechanisms of accountability at the international level, but 1325 is also very much about national actions and measures of accountability at the national level. And I wonder if any of the panelists would want to say a few words about that. It is about interagency processes. I know we're going to talk about that in the afternoon, but I wonder if any of the panelists would like to say something in closing with regard to the national accountability mechanisms. And then afterwards I would hand it over to our chef d'orchestre, Kathleen. Anybody want to say something about the national?
I'll say a few. In the 6 countries that we were looking at, what's interesting is that you have different versions of how governments have taken this on board. So in Colombia, they've passed a law that specifies the inclusion of women civil society representatives in the National Commission for, I think it's reconciliation or reparation. In different places, different things have happened. National action plans, obviously, are also being developed. The problem is that we're seeing a lot of form and very little function. And by that, I mean that you have the policies or the legislation, but the practice is really failing. And again, there's not enough monitoring going on and inclusion and accountability at that level. And one of the initiatives that is currently sort of being started and hoping to rev up is actually the Global Network of Women Peace Builders that Mavik, I hope, will talk about. And the idea behind that is to really take this issue and the indicators and the accountability down to a local level, to make this local law. Because sometimes what happens at a very local level is much more important than what's happening at the national level. So to really take it down and to embed it, I think that's definitely going to be an important piece of the puzzle. The other thing, frankly, is holding the government's feet to the fire. I mean, the government in Liberia has a great national action plan, but civil society organizations that were getting funding to provide services to communities, to provide prevention and protection for girls from sexual violence, now their funding is going through governments, and many of them are losing out. So what we call, the people are actually on the ground doing the work, are at risk of losing out the resources that they need to do the work, because we're impressed with what the government is saying, but the question, the issue of what function are they playing is going to be much more important than what form it takes, I think.
Tori?
I have a different comment.
Okay.
Just quickly, I believe national action plans are important, but they're important as a process more than a document, in my mind. To force a government to reach out to civil society, to reach out to ministries within its own government that normally wouldn't deal on these issues. And so to say to the defense minister, you have to be part of this process of putting together a national action plan, which then focuses attention on the responsibilities in those areas. To say to the Minister of Education, you have to be a part of this process. That's part of the process of mainstreaming, and I think it's absolutely essential. We've been talking a lot about, in effect, stovepiping, empowering women at the peace table. But it's also important to get as Sanam was saying, the resident coordinator thinking every day about this, to get the representative of all the different UN agencies and all the different ministers involved. And if you can do that and use the process as a means of inclusively reaching out, again, to the corporate sector, to different ministries, to civil society groups, then you can have an important element. I think it's also important at some point for us to formalize the National Action Plan process. As everyone knows, the National Action Plans are not mentioned in 1325. They came about 3 years later as a result of 2002, as a result of some comments. But we don't even know exactly what a National Action Plan should look like. And so I think it would be important to instrumentalize that process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Tor? Yeah, please.
I think the two comments that Dawn just made about the resident coordinators, which I also mentioned earlier, Sanam mentioned, I think if you really ask the resident coordinators, which I have done in many cases, they have not received any instructions from the Secretary General. They are the appointees of the Secretary General. And they are his representative in the country. They are Mr. or Madame UN in the country. And they should get. So for this, we don't need even extra day. Tomorrow, the Secretary General can shoot out an instruction that this is what you should do. So that is what I say in my indicators, what the Secretary General. The other thing you mentioned about the process of the National Action Plan, I believe that is why it is very important for the leadership of those countries to discuss the 1325 issues at the cabinet level will involve all the ministers, the defense minister, the education minister, the women's affairs minister. So that is also necessary. That I believe that process also can be triggered if Secretary General tomorrow writes to all heads of state. He writes on all kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. But this issue has missed his signature.
Thank you very much. Tori?
Yep. This kind of, I think, goes to a separate question. But if we are about aspiration becoming practical, there was just a comment that the Council needs to get its act together. I actually want to push back a little bit. I think the Council has been extraordinary in the amount of resolutions that have been passed and the attention paid. And at some level, you have to look at what's the Council and what do we want the result to be. And if there's some result that's not happening, look at the machinery that connects the resolutions. This is obviously a political body. It could do more. But there's a lot of other mechanisms that need attention. So I'll maybe go back to my remarks, which is, if we think things are stuck, show up, explain why this matters, and give the practical advice that many of the speakers have done today. I don't think there's a lack across the board of goodwill, but there's a lack of understanding how it solves the problem of the person whose job it is to go do X. And then someone says up, and I've got a gender strategy for you. If that gender strategy helps solve problem X, you have no resistance. So our resistance is making this become part of the solution to what people do every day. So I'm saying a very obvious point. But I just think that more resolutions from the Council, from my personal view, is not necessarily our problem. That will feel good, and it won't necessarily change what everybody's been talking about today. Speaking of change, I have some fabulous colleagues in the room. I, unfortunately, can't stay for much of the session. But I want to recognize that the State Department's here in full, multiple offices, including the IO Bureau. I'm very thrilled our colleagues came down from New York with our U.S. mission to the UN. They live and breathe this as well. So if I've said something dumb, they'll be much smarter than I am. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll give one last minute, and then we have to wrap it up.
Thank you, Moderator. I'm Mavi Cabrera-Baleza from the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. I think the reason why it took us 10 years to even look at the indicators, which should have been fundamental in any policy discussion and policy implementation, is because there's a number of missing links, and many of them have already been identified. One is political will. Political will coupled with adequate resources to implement these policies. And we all know that there's a huge disconnect between all the beautiful words that we hear every 10th anniversary of 1325 and what's happening at the country level. And why is there a huge disconnect? There's a huge disconnect because there's very little ownership. There's hardly any ownership. And how could ownership be promoted or be achieved? It could only be achieved if we have a capable civil society. Civil society that are aware, fully aware of these laws, understand what these laws are about, and understand how they could be implemented. And here I go back to a point already raised by Sanam and Don. I think that in my country, in the Philippines, for example, there have been a number of policies that highlight women's participation in peace building and reconstruction, and two of them even predate 1325. But why have they not made a difference? They have not made a difference because the women who are mostly affected by conflict are not even aware of them. There's no lead implementing agency. There's no implementing rules and regulations. So a number of key components for implementation are absent. And I think we're all learning this as we go forward. And the 10th anniversary has provided that platform to realize all of those and put realize all of those and make all those missing links work, finally.
Okay, thank you very much. Communication, leadership, and money. And Don wanted to have
2 sentences. In that regard, the United Nations is now in a process of preparing its report based on 1889, very significant report on the role of women in peace-building processes. What has become clear, it is a very fine report. It has moved dramatically. The people preparing it are fabulous, but they are in-house people, and they are focused on what's doable, what the market will bear, etc. We as civil society have to be saying, you can do better. You can push the envelope beyond this. There are some key elements where they just say, we're not going to take on the bureaucracy. We're just going to accept the fact, for example, that you can't have quotas for women's participation. I think it's the role of civil society to say, you can do better. And until we as a community have that pressure on them, we're not going to get the kind of progress that we want.
Thank you, Don. Before I hand it over to Kathleen, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists. I'd like to thank in particular Assistant Secretary of State Tori Holt and our honorary panelist, Ambassador Chantal. Please join me. Kathleen.
I am going to thank Chantal for a marvelous job of moderating and for really an excellent panel of getting us into the conversation between the government, civil society, and all the actors here within this room. I want to also bid farewell to our webcast participants at this point. Thank you for joining us. If you have further comments, please reach us at gender@usip.org. Thank you very much to our participants.